Although it feels like Thanksgiving break was months ago, wasn't too long that we were about to go on break, enjoy our meals with our families, and then we hear about President Joe Biden and what his Thanksgiving plans were. In fact, President Joe Biden and his family decided to spend their Thanksgiving holiday at the Nantucket home of private equity billionaire David Rubenstein.
Now, we know the president likes to emphasize his middle-class roots, but during this stay, the family is staying at the 13-acre, $30 million compound that is owned by private equity billionaire David Rubenstein, who made it available during this visit.
David Rubenstein made it available during the visit. What's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that David Rubenstein happens to be the co-CEO of the Carlyle Group, a private equity firm, and that's pretty much how he acquired or accumulated his massive wealth. Apparently, Rubenstein, who's worth $4.5 billion, was not there during this Thanksgiving holiday, but still, the optics of Biden's Thanksgiving plans were pretty awful. I mean, consider how Democrats campaigned against Virginia's Republican governor-elect, Glenn Youngkin, by mentioning the fact that he had ties to the Carlyle Group as a co-CEO. And while campaigning for Democratic incumbent Terry McAuliffe, Biden made Youngkin sound like a real threat to American democracy. In fact, he was quoted as saying, "Extremism can come in many forms. It can come in the rage of a mob driven in an assault, driven to assault the Capitol. It could come in a smile and a fleece vest." Oh, wow. I mean, Glenn Youngkin, so dangerous, especially considering he was the co-CEO of the Carlyle Group. Now, the Bidens are openly hanging out at the so-called compound belonging to the private equity firm's other co-founder and co-CEO. But Biden brushed aside and dismissed any criticism and even referred to Rubenstein as a friend. The statement released, the president and the first lady, Jill Biden, touched down in Nantucket night to spend the holiday week with extended family, planning to stay at the home of their friend David Rubenstein, as they have done, the White House told reporters. They've done it for a long time, apparently going back to the 1970s. And it's about his relationship, though, with David Rubenstein. That's the real problem here. Yes, the optics are terrible. Yes, the Democrats are hypocrites when they're campaigning against private equity co-CEOs and then turning around and vacationing in their homes. However, what I want to talk about is the kind of influence that someone like Rubenstein has over the Democratic Party, and especially over someone like Joe Biden. Unfortunately, the ties between Wall Street and our government have never been stronger. Carlyle specialized, by the way, in buying and selling businesses that relied on government spending, and it hired former government officials to help it. Carlyle partners included James Baker III, a former Treasury Secretary, and Frank Carlucci, a former Defense Secretary. President Emeritus George H.W. Bush was also an advisor to the firm. Now, Biden, much like the Republicans he claims to be a more decent human being than, has benefited handsomely from campaign donations coming from private equity firms like the Carlyle Group. In fact, during the Democratic primaries in 2020, Liz Featherstone wrote in Jacobin that Joe Biden is in fact a huge favorite of private equity donors, getting large sums from Blackstone and drawing more contributions from Carlyle Group and Apollo Global Management than on any other candidate. In fact, Open Secrets details just how much money the Carlyle Group spent on lobbying in 2020 alone, which was more than $4 million in legalized bribes to both Democrats and Republicans. Let's take a look at the numbers. So, total number of contributions. Again, this is in 2020 alone, almost $4 million. And that is pretty significant. And they didn't just focus on Democrats or Republicans. They gave a little more to Democrats. But if you look at this graph, you'll see that they make sure to use their influence on both parties here. And when looking at individuals who were recipients of the Carlyle Group cash, Joe Biden was, of course, at the very top, having received the most amount of money. $101,827. Again, this is from the Carlyle Group directly to recipient Joe Biden as he's campaigning for president of the United States. And even though Republicans are just as addicted to Wall Street cash, conservative media did not in any way hesitate to exploit the bad optics associated with Biden vacationing in the home of David Rubenstein. Here's Peter Doocy asking White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki about it just before the Thanksgiving break.
What message does it send to the middle-class Americans President Biden says that he's trying to help, who are struggling this week to cover the cost of the most expensive Thanksgiving ever, that the president is going to take a few days off at a billionaire's compound in Nantucket?
Well, first I would say, I don't know if you've cooked a turkey before, but a 20-pound turkey is a pretty big turkey. I think we can all agree. They're about $1 more. So not to minimize that, any increase in prices is something the president is concerned about, as is evidenced by his announcement today and as his efforts to push forward on additional relief for the American people. But I just want to be clear that there are abundance of turkeys available. They're about $1 more for a 20-pound bird, which is a huge bird if you're feeding a very big family. And that's something that, again, we've been working to make sure people have more money in their pockets to address it as the economy is turning back on.
Now, Peter Doocy, of course, is trying to play populist by asking that question. But since it's completely disingenuous, he, of course, didn't frame the question in a way that would have been far more effective at getting at the heart of the issue. This isn't about the inflation associated with turkeys. This is about the type of corporate influence that has corrupted both parties and certainly has, in fact, corrupted the Democratic Party to the point where on substantive issues, we don't really see much difference between Democrats and Republicans, certainly when it comes to Wall Street and these big banks. Now, again, having friendly relationships with people like the co-CEO of the Carlyle Group is worth noting. And the reason why it's worth noting is because we see how economic policy gets proposed or rolled out by the Democratic Party while they campaign pretending to be any different from Republicans. So something else happened that week that the reporters somehow failed to connect the dots to. That very same week, Joe Biden decided to reappoint Jerome Powell as the chair of the Federal Reserve. And believe it or not, that story is very much connected to the fact that Biden stayed in the home of Carlyle Group's co-CEO, Rubenstein. So let's talk about that a little bit. Jerome Powell was appointed by Donald Trump. Why the hell would Joe Biden reappoint him, especially because of the fact that his monetary policy has actually been pretty disastrous in regard to inflation in the housing market? In the early 2000s, turns out that Powell was a partner at the Carlyle Group, a private equity firm that specialized in hiring former government officials and cashing in on their connections. At Carlyle, Powell learned firsthand about the debt-driven business model of the private equity business, which delivered hundreds of millions of dollars of profit to senior partners while saddling the companies they bought and sold with debt and downsizing. What happened at Toys R Us is a perfect example of the disgusting behavior of these predatory private equity firms. But we'll talk about that in more detail at another time. Private equity firms have benefited significantly from monetary policy that Jerome Powell put in overdrive while chairing the Fed. So that policy is known as quantitative easing. I've spoken about it before, but here's a quick explainer video to show you what this monetary policy is and how it benefits private equity firms and big banks.
The process works like this. 1. The central bank waves its magic wand and creates money. 2. It then gives that money to commercial banks by buying assets from them, such as bonds or mortgage-backed securities. And that's how the money ends up in the financial system. 3. What commercial banks do with that money is outside the central bank's control. Central banks hope commercial banks will lend to people so that they can buy goods and services, thereby jump-starting the economy. So far, this hasn't happened. Banks preferred to keep most of the money as reserves, which explains why we didn't have consumer price inflation. The only result of the money creation so far has been that the price of assets, such as bonds and stocks, went up.
That's right, people. They take the money from the Federal Reserve, which claims that the money is meant to be lent to ordinary Americans, to small businesses. They just take the money and they make their own investments to enrich themselves. And there has, in fact, been an issue with inflation in regard to assets like real estate, assets like housing, which I've talked about before, but we'll get into it a little deeper later in the segment. Now, just to give you a little more detailed information about how monetary policy works and who really benefits from it, Christopher Leonard writes in Fortune that the Fed doesn't create dollars in the bank accounts of ordinary Americans. Rather, it can only create dollars inside the bank vaults of 24 elite institutions on Wall Street called primary dealers, which include banks like JP Morgan and Citigroup. When the Fed prints money, it essentially engages in an extreme form of trickle-down economics by giving new cash to the biggest banks in America in hopes that they will eventually create jobs and boost wages. Now, as we know, the money doesn't actually doesn't trickle down to ordinary Americans at all. Private equity firms use the money to invest in assets like real estate, which again, we'll get back to in just a bit. Between 2008 and 2014, the Federal Reserve created roughly 3 times as much money as it had created between 1913 and 2007. In other words, it crammed about 300 years worth of money growth into a few short years. And that was before Powell's chairmanship at the Fed. But in a salute to disaster capitalism, Powell exploited the pandemic to put quantitative easing in overdrive. So when COVID hit in 2020, the Fed printed about another 300 more years worth of money in a period of months, some $3 trillion. And by the way, as that was happening, what was Congress doing in regard to any stimulus or financial relief for ordinary American people? Nickel and diming the hell out of us. And remember, the Federal Reserve is not a body that is democratically elected. The individuals working at the Fed are appointed, much like the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell. Now, the Carlyle Group absolutely loves the Federal Reserve's monetary policy. Many years of easy money policies by the Federal Reserve have been rocket fuel for private equity firms like Carlyle Group because cheap debt is their lifeblood. It funds their ambitious takeover plans and even funds their paychecks directly. In other words, former Carlyle Group employees who now serve in the Federal Reserve implement the very monetary policy that directly benefits their former employers. That's what's happening with Jerome Powell. I really wish that some of these reporters would ask specifically about that. Now, not only does the money fail to trickle down, the money ends up getting invested in ways that actually leads to more pain and suffering for the poorest Americans across the country. Carlyle Group in particular loves to invest in mobile home parks. What they do is what typical flippers do, except they do it on a wide scale. They buy mobile home parks. They do light renovations, if they do any renovations at all, and then they immediately jack up rent prices to essentially something that's so incredibly unaffordable, thus targeting and hurting the most vulnerable Americans. According to the federal housing surveys, around 20 million Americans, roughly 1 in 18, live in mobile homes, in part because they can cost half that of a traditional site-built home. Now, back in 2016, PBS NewsHour profiled Carla Burr, who sold her condo in Manassas, Virginia, to purchase a mobile home. But soon she noticed that her rent kept going up drastically.
I chose to move here because it was a beautiful house. And I thought, man, I could retire here.
Now 61 years old, Burr and her home may need to move. While she owns the home, she made the purchase in cash, she doesn't own the land underneath. Every month, Burr pays rent to a property manager. Over the past 10 years, that lot rent has gone up 30%, from $740 a month to $1,022 a month.
I had no clue that the rent was going to go up the way it did. I mean, it's to the point now where it's more than half my Social Security. I would love to stay, and I would love to keep it right where it is, because everything I have is here. All my church is here, my family's here, everybody's here.
Now, private equity firms like the Carlyle Group absolutely love to invest in mobile home parks because the fact of the matter is they have a captive group of people that they can completely exploit. Individuals who own mobile homes do not own the land that their mobile homes sit on. And as a result, they have to pay rent in order to rent that land to place their mobile home. When the Carlyle Group comes in, they're able to jack up that rent. And if the individuals owning the mobile homes want to move, it's actually incredibly difficult to do that. Doing so costs tens of thousands of dollars, and most homes aren't considered real estate. Mobile homes aren't considered real estate. They're considered personal possessions that depreciate in value. So if the individual owning the mobile home wants to sell it, they're kind of stuck because no one really wants to buy it unless they're willing to take a massive loss.
Like cars, manufactured homes often depreciate, losing value the longer they're owned. Carla Burr believes the value of her manufactured home has plummeted since she purchased a decade ago. She thinks if she sold it today, she'd get $40,000 less than she paid.
If you're in an apartment, you can move. At the end of your lease, you can say, I'm out of here, it's too high. I don't have that luxury. This house can't move. I mean, unless you go through major hoops to do it.
When the Carlyle Group, for instance, bought the Plaza del Rey mobile home park in Sunnyvale, Ohio 5 years ago, they put the residents of the park's 812 homes in the exact same predicament. In fact, one of the residents living in that mobile home park was quoted as saying, "It's worse than being stuck. It's absolute desperation." This predatory activity has led to copycat individuals, investors essentially doing the same thing. And what they do is they pay thousands of dollars for these seminars to educate them about how they can invest their money in mobile home parks and exploit the residents, much like the Carlyle Group does. What really stood out to me in a video about this put together by The Guardian was how they not only know that they have captive residents that they can exploit, they're overjoyed by that fact. Watch.
The big thing is they can really tolerate rent increases really well. So the family parks are our favorite park. Almost all of the parks we have, with rare exceptions, are all family parks. And it pretty much works throughout America because there's so much need for affordable housing right now. It didn't work at all back in the 50s and 60s. There were no poor people. So basically, you couldn't make it work. Today, there's a huge number of poor people, and there's more poor people like every day.
Today, there's a huge number of poor people. There's more poor people every day. Why not take advantage of their vulnerable housing situation and jack up their rents, knowing that they're unable to sell their mobile homes, they're unable to move? Let's just take advantage of that. That's essentially what people are paying thousands of dollars to learn at Mobile Home University. Anyway, getting back to the Carlyle Group. Throughout the years, Carlyle Group has purchased thousands of mobile homes, or mobile home lots, I should say, throughout the country. Unsurprisingly, they managed to spend hundreds of millions of dollars during the pandemic to do just that. And they did so with money that was given to them by the Federal Reserve. In fact, the Carlyle Group made a huge splash in Mesa, Arizona, acquiring 4 mobile home parks in the city for a total of $230 million. So while Jerome Powell would have you believe that quantitative easing and the Fed's monetary policy is just another example of wonderful trickle-down economics. It provides liquidity to the markets that somehow gets into the pockets of ordinary Americans. Fact of the matter is that is untrue. It just continues to enrich the very top. It continues to enrich his former employers over at the Carlyle Group, and it ends up putting Americans at a massive disadvantage at a time when we're already dealing with a housing crisis. So whether Trump originally appointed Jerome Powell to the Fed is irrelevant to Biden when he's spending Thanksgiving in the 13-acre compound owned by Powell's former boss. So next time you hear Biden bragging about the measly $150 billion allocated for affordable housing in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, consider that the funding doesn't even scratch the surface. It doesn't even put a dent in the damage caused by big banks and private equity firms that he seems to constantly give a pass to and do favors for. After all, vacationing in a billionaire's massive compound does in fact come with strings attached.
Man, the quantitative easing stuff is something that is so hard to wrap your mind around. You know, I saw this video of Yanis Varoufakis trying to explain it to Slavoj Žižek, which was hilarious because Slavoj Žižek was listening and not interrupting him or talking and stuff, which, you know, shows just like how hard it is to understand for the average person. But it basically, I think you summed it up beautifully, where it's like, it's essentially just money for the rich people, and that's it. And they just give it to them. And I think like a lot of the stuff that you're seeing, a lot of the weird stuff that we're seeing now, especially with like crypto and NFTs and all that stuff, like I get the sense that it has something to do with the fact that there's all this just money sloshing around and they literally don't know what to do with it. So they have to like invent these kind of fake things to play with. But yeah, I mean, the Biden thing is just like, I mean, they don't even care anymore. Like they don't even have any shame. They just, you know, you just gotta shut up and take it.
We've been vacationing in Nantucket since the 1970s, so buzz off. Like that was basically the take. But it's not about where you're vacationing. It's about the corruption associated with staying in the compound belonging to the co-CEO of the Carlyle Group. And again, I just want to give myself a pat on the back, which I don't do often, because literally no one else connected those dots. That the very same week, he reappointed Jerome Powell to the Federal Reserve, who, again, put quantitative easing on overdrive. Anyway, I love this topic. I'm sure I'm going to do other decodes on it in the future, but I'm always happy to explain it. And by the way, I did watch that video with Zizek and Varoufakis. It was great, especially because it is complicated, but you don't really need to complicate it much. Just know that an undemocratic group of people, meaning they weren't elected, get to make these massive decisions about pumping money, pumping capital into big banks and private equity firms. And then they just use that money to further enrich themselves. That's all that happens. No congressional approval necessary.
If you enjoyed this video from Jacobin Weekends, please hit like and subscribe. That way, you'll enjoy all of our backlog, as well as all of our future content, including interviews, live streams, and clips. Thank you.